Welcome to the Future of the Grid, Real Estate at the Center of the Energy Transition webinar. My name is Sarah McHugh, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Telesto Strategy. I'm joined by my colleagues and Telesto Strategy partners, Andrew Aylesbury and Ben Vatterat. Telesto Strategy is a management consulting firm headquartered in Chicago, Illinois. We help real estate and built environment leaders deliver sustainable strategies that drive growth, boost capital productivity, and build resilience in a rapidly changing climate. During today's webinar, if you have questions for Andrew and Ben, please submit them using the Q&A feature. I'll be monitoring them throughout the session, and Andrew and Ben will address as many as time permits during the Q&A segment of today's webinar. Now, I will pass it over to Ben. Ben?
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everyone on this call for joining today. We are so excited to have this webinar because just yesterday, we launched our 2025 Parallax Report, and we're going to be talking about that in today's webinar. This report was developed using our firm's proprietary Parallax tool. This is a tool which is a forward-looking forecast of what the energy grid is going to look like going forward under a variety of scenarios. And at a highly granular level, we look at energy supply, energy demand, e-grid factors, and so on. And we do this every year. We refresh it annually. Using this tool, our firm developed the Parallax Report, which we're going to be talking about today. And this unpacks the high-level trends that we're seeing in the grid. What are we seeing in grid decarbonization? What are we seeing in that demand and supply? I know everyone is talking about AI and data centers. We're definitely going to touch on that and think through what these trends mean for actors in this space. What does it mean for real estate players that are seeking to think about and optimize their capital deployments, that are thinking about decarbonization? So I am delighted to be joined today by the lead author of this report, Andrew, who will be walking us through some of the findings. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. So we're going to start off here with a quick presentation. I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through some of the main findings of the report, and then we'll have a bit of a fireside chat. Ben and I will to go a little bit deeper and to answer any questions you all might have. So I'm going to share my screen here to walk through some of the main findings. And I think the first place we can start off with is why did we do this at all? Why did we bother looking into what the evolution of the grid is likely to look like? What does it matter for real estate? And I don't know that necessarily is a surprise to anyone, but just to spell it out in even greater detail, of course, real estate, big electricity consumer across the board. Something like 75% of all of the US's electricity is in fact consumed by the real estate sector. And beyond that, a lot of the direct and indirect emissions that are part of that come from homes and businesses and their built environment forms. Furthermore, depending on what your real estate asset class is or your asset type is, you may also be in a specific asset type that is very energy intensive. That could be food sales, that could be healthcare, inpatient and outpatient, that could be assisted living. It could also be industrials. All of these are quite energy intensive asset types. And of course, energy is also really impactful on operating costs. Something like 33% of the typical operating budget of a commercial building has something to do with energy use. And all of this also comes at a time where we're seeing a lot of growth in state and local building performance standards, also known as BPSs. By the latest count, I think there are 35 active across the US, but that number is expected to grow. And a lot of these building performance standards, in addition to requiring benchmarking along energy use intensity, they also sometimes include sort of performance standards and sort of push building owners and operators towards greater and greater energy efficiency. So what is going on? What did we learn when we did this refresh of our Parallax model, as Ben described earlier on? Well, we started out by looking at sort of 5 major macro trends that are really reshaping the grid currently. Some on the demand side and some on the supply side. On the demand side, no surprise here, proliferation of data centers is really top of mind for everyone. I'm based in Washington, D.C., even though Telesto is based in Chicago. I live in an area that is often considered to be data center alley. This is all we think about as how the impact of data centers are reshaping our grid. At the same time, there's another demand component here that we looked at, which is manufacturing resurgence or onshoring. This is something that was taking place a lot during the Biden administration with a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act efforts, but it's also been a key part of the Trump administration's push as well. And then on the supply side, there's been a lot of regulatory changes, most notably a lot of rolling back of that Inflation Reduction Act with the One Big Beautiful Bill. That will have implications for sure on the amount of generation that's available to customers across the board. There's also this persistent issue of transmission bottlenecks, which is not new, but continues to be a challenge for getting more energy to where it's needed. And lastly, something that is fairly new within this year is all the tariffs and trade dynamics that have been playing out and have been having a lot of implications for both the generation and availability within the US markets. So we'll explore each one of these a little bit more in detail. Obviously, the report itself, which will be available later on, will go into much more detail if that's something you're interested in. So first, let's talk a little bit about the proliferation of data centers. In the last 10 years, between 2014 and 2024, the amount of electricity that data centers across the US consume has tripled. And that number is expected to triple once again between 2024 and 2030. So it's actually accelerating. And it's going to, right now, based on the current projections, it's expected to reach something like 600 plus terawatt hours of annual consumption. Now, just to put that in context, since I know not everyone on this call is probably an energy engineer, that 600 terawatt hours is actually about 40% more than what the total electricity consumption of the entire nation of France is. So these data centers could be accounting for a really substantial portion of what the electricity demanded by the grid is able to provide. And it's happening really quickly. If you know a lot about sort of the way that electricity has worked in the past, at least in the United States, it's been fairly slow growing, at least on the demand side, and it's been largely consistent with either GDP growth or population growth. So the fact that data centers are coming in and proliferating this quickly presents a quite new challenge for what the grid can deal with. That other demand factor that we want to look at is also around the reshoring and growth of manufacturing in the United States. An early precursor to more manufacturing growth and supply is always the construction side of things. And what you see here is that the total construction spending on manufacturing in the US has gone up nearly 200% between Q1 2020 and sort of the end of 2023 and early 2024. So these are all precursors that are indicating that there are a lot more industrial and manufacturing buildings out there. And of course, these all are some of the highest electricity consuming asset types in the real estate sector. So you should expect to see this also contributing to more of that electricity demand that's going up. So changing gears a bit to the supply side of things. On this particular macro trend, I think what you'll see is that it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, a lot of federal action is slowing down the greening of the grid and also having somewhat of an impact on the total overall availability of energy. You have the OBBA, which notably rolled back a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act's clean energy incentives. That was around solar, but also around a bunch of other renewables. And this is expected, I think, in the long run to result in something like a 15% reduction in the overall capacity of renewables in the United States, which in turn, the latest projections by many are suggesting that this could end up resulting in a price increase for average electricity across the US as much as 18%. And then also you have the Clean Air Act, right? So there was recently a good deal of legislation that came out where the EPA is actually proposing to repeal greenhouse gas limits for new fossil fuel generating capacity in the grid. So all of this is sort of pointing to a less green, at least at the federal level, approach to electricity generation. But on the other hand, you have a lot of local municipal regulations or state level regulations, which are actually looking for more energy efficient and cleaner properties. Just to name a couple notable examples, although there are many, the city of Boston, BERDO, which is the Building Emission Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance. This is a particularly strict ordinance, which is expected to go into effect in 2025, which will actually set emissions thresholds for buildings. And then you also have Seattle's, which is doing something similar. There's also local law 97 in New York City, which also have similar pushes. So on the one hand, the grid, at least based on what the federal action is pushing towards, is likely to get less green. And on the other hand, municipal and state level regulations through these BPSs are requesting of building owners that they be more energy efficient and greener with their operations. So looking at the next macro trend on the supply side, we're talking here about transmission bottlenecks. I said this is not a new challenge. This has long been a challenge for the US grid, but it's just continued to be something that hasn't really improved overall. So in 2023 alone, for example, something like only 55 miles of high voltage transmission lines were actually added to the United States grid. I don't know if we have 2024 or 2025 data yet, but I would expect that that has not changed a lot. And what this effectively does is it just creates a bottleneck for generation getting from where it's created to actual end uses, and continues to create challenges for and pressures on the electrical grid. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about the tariff and trade dynamics. It has been no secret that the Trump administration has been pushing very hard on making changes to the United States's trade relationships with a lot of its trading partners. That could be China, that could be Canada, that could be Mexico, that could be a whole host of trade partners. But just to put this in context, the average effective US tariff rate has something like gone up by 7x since the end of 2024 to August 2025. And even though that might change based on what's going on right now in the Supreme Court and how the Supreme Court is about to rule on what the presidential capacity to set tariffs is, at least right now, the picture is quite challenging when it comes to the supply side of things. And that sort of plays out in two ways. On the one hand, a lot of the components that go into renewable sources of energy, think solar panels, but also some of the intermediate products like a whole host of metals, steel, aluminum, copper, so on and so forth. All of these are being tariffed at much higher rates than they were even a year ago. And this, of course, puts pressure on the supply side of things. If it's more expensive to import all of these components, well, in the time that we are not producing them locally, they're going to be more expensive. And that means that there's likely to be a lot less deployment of these types of renewable energy on the grid. That's part one of this. Part two of this, actually, in some of the different regions of the United States, there is actually direct importation of energy from Canada. Now, Canada, actually, a very large portion of what the energy that it produces is from hydroelectric sources, which, if you're just thinking about purely the greenness of the electricity that they produce, that is a very, very green source. So if you're in upstate New York, for example, not all of it, but some portion of the energy you might consume from the grid, at least in the past, was imported from Canada and was considered quite green. Well, in retaliation to some of the import tariffs that the US was placing on Canada, Canada at least was considering and also was in the process of thinking through deploying these taxes or outright bans on sort of exporting electricity directly to the United States. So if you are in some of those more, or you have assets in some of those regions of the United States, which are closer to Canada and may rely on some Canadian electricity, at a minimum, you will likely see less electricity coming to you, and that will have an effect, obviously, on price. But also, given that the Canadian grid is as green as it is due to a lot of the hydroelectric power that is there, it also means that the e-grid factors in those areas are also likely to become less green. So what does this all mean then for real estate leaders? What do all these 5 different macro trends, when you sort of tally them all up, what do they mean at the end of the day? And what we are sort of projecting here is that when you take a look at all these things, in 2024, the United States was actually in a fairly modest surplus of about 150 terawatt hours. That is to say, roughly something like 150 terawatt hours, more than 150 terawatt hours were produced than were directly consumed. And this is sort of averaged out across the whole grid. Coming up to 2030, there is obviously expected to be some amount of supply increase, but the totality of those 5 trends that we looked at, the impact of increased demand from data centers, the reshoring, the regulatory trends, the tariffs, and the transmission bottlenecks, these are expected to actually have a negative impact on the grid, which is greater than that 215. And so we will see, we expect the United States move from a modest surplus of electricity to a modest deficit of electricity by 2030. And while this is, on paper, it doesn't seem like such a large number, it's also important to point out that this is directionally very different from the way it's been in the past, right? So I said before, for many, many years, the United States got very used to extremely predictable and relatively slow growth of electricity demand, and often the grid has kept up. We are likely going to move in very short order from a totally different way of doing things to now this environment where we're going to see a lot more demand and supply pressures. And so moving to a deficit is a relatively different future than what the past has shown. And this will likely play out in a couple of ways. Perhaps most notably is actually through the impact on price. So in 2026 alone, the average price of electricity across the United States is expected to go up by something like 6.4% for residential and commercial customers. And this obviously is very different depending on what region you're in. In the most extreme case, if you're in a lot of New England, the projection is something like 14.5%. If you're in the Mid-Atlantic, it's 11.3%. But overall, all of these grids across the United States are expected to see some pretty substantial growth in price. And looking forward even further, when you sort of extrapolate to 2030, that was just for 2026, sort of a near-term projection. When we looked at this going forward out to 2030, there was the assumption of sort of a baseline increase per year of something like 3.1% in the price of electricity. Well, now when you add in this idea of these tariffs, the data centers, the regulatory changes, the manufacturing, and to some extent the bottlenecks, we're actually projecting that it won't just be 3.1% per year. It will actually be something closer to 5.2% per year, which is, again, a fairly substantial change in the growth rate, because this is not just a one-time thing. This is now, we're saying, on an annual basis, we expect the price of electricity to go up by that much more based on all these different pressures. And that's just the price side of things here, right? So I think underlying all of this, given sort of the ways in which this is shifting, we're also expecting to really see that the grid is probably going to be substantially less green over time. I think Ben mentioned at the outset that this is an exercise we do sort of on an annual basis, is looking forward, trying to project what do we think the greening of the grid will look like. Well, that's what you see initially here is this dark blue line, which drops pretty precipitously. That was our projections from 2024. When we did the same sort of exercise, we looked at the totality of what was going on with all the different macro trends. We projected that based on the IRA and a whole host of other things, the average e-grid factor, emissions factor for the United States was expected to get substantially greener and fairly quickly. And we obviously woke up to a very different world around January of this year. and started seeing that things were moving in a very different direction. And so when we moved to update these projections, now that we know what we know about the way that things are changing, we found that this evolution of the grid and the emissions factor of the grid is expected to be very, very different going forward. And if you compare sort of where we were last year with our projections versus where we are this year now with our updated projections, I think we expect to see by 2040 that the grid will be something like 29% less green than it was where we were last year. Now, the nice thing about these are projections, obviously. Trying to be glass half full here. Who knows if this could change again and we get an adjustment in the green direction, meaning, we see updated 2 years from now that our curve again adjusts very substantially, but in the opposite direction. It would be great to see that play out in that way. And so finally, what does this all mean for real estate players? What does this mean for leaders in real estate such as yourselves? Well, first of all, the grid moving to a deficit by 2030, at least in current projections, is probably going to have some very material impacts for you all. It could mean a higher likelihood of shortages and curtailments. That's not something I think a lot of American consumers of electricity are used to, but it may end up actually being the case. And that might have an effect on property values and also tenant retention. It will almost certainly mean rising electricity prices. Whether that equilibrates in the future and generations able to quickly catch up, that remains to be seen. But right now, we are projecting that those price increases we were talking about, that 5+% per year increase in growth rate, is expected to have something like $188 billion increase in the cost of electricity across the board for all US real estate players. It will likely also mean that there will be you will have a harder time complying, or at least it will cost more to comply with these emerging building performance standards, right? Especially if they are more emissions focused, and yet the electricity you're pulling from the grid is dirtier than ever before. That means it'll become harder to comply with those different regimes. And there may also be regional hotspots of risk. We've talked at a relatively generalized level about what this looks like across the US, but not all regions will feel this impact in the same way. If you're in a region that really depends on or has a lot of demand from data centers, you're likely looking in a very different future from a region of the country that just doesn't have that same level of demand. So it can really play out in extremely different ways at local levels. So what should you do about this? Well, I think at a minimum, it's worth considering how you accelerate or plan your electrification of things. I know that at the same time, if you have sustainability goals, reducing operational emissions, that often means that you're moving towards greater electrification of appliances or HVAC systems and things of that nature. Well, the downside of that is they draw a lot more electricity from the grid. So thinking through how this interplays with potentially a future where the cost of electricity is substantially higher than it is today is worth thinking about. And also it's worth thinking about investing in behind the meter renewables, right? So if the cost of electricity from the grid is going to get higher, that's something that you maybe can't control. But behind the meter, something that's on site is something that you might have greater control over. And lastly, it's also worth thinking through tools that allow you to sort of optimize for emissions and energy use across your grid. Retrofits, energy efficient retrofits, are one of the most effective methods of controlling the cost of electricity. If you consume less electricity, well, there you go. You don't have to pay as much for it when the bill comes due. So that's sort of the end of the presentation here. I'm going to hand it back over to Ben, and I think we're going to have a more in-depth conversation about some of these findings.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And that was great. That's the first time I've actually received that full presentation by Andrew, and every time I hear him speak on this topic, I learn something new. It is such a conglomeration of different narratives in this story of what's happening to the grid. Andrew covered these 5, 6 different macroeconomic trends that are shaping demand and supply. We've got tariffs. There's the evolution of AI and data centers. So I'd love to unpack some of those narratives just a little bit more during this fireside chat portion of the conversation. As I'm doing that, there is a Q&A function in the webinar interface. So please, if you would like to submit a question for Andrew, please use that. And we'll take a look at those submitted questions at the end of this portion. So Andrew, my first question for you is that on the regulatory front, what's happening with the grid is obviously interplaying with the regulatory regimes that are happening at a city and state level with regards to BPS, building performance standards. You did mention this during your presentation. And I'd love to unpack a little bit, what does it mean to comply with those regulations while the grid is going through these enormous changes? And not only, to your point, is it going through these big changes, but the rate of change and the direction of change and all these things are changing every year or 2 or 3 based on what's happening in Washington, based on the technology developments and so on and so forth. I'm sure you could go down a long list here. So putting this all together, building owners and operators, they need to comply with BPS. They have to get their energy more or less from the grid outside their front door. How should they be thinking about all this?
Yeah, a great question. I think first it's helpful to understand the flavors, if you will, of BPS, right? So you have BPS, which is purely benchmarking focused, which means every year or whatever the reporting cadence might be, you have to report to the authorities on a whole host of things. But most often it's at a minimum energy consumption, some sort of energy use intensity. There might be water included. You may be in a regulatory regime also where they want to think through emissions. That flavor of BPS is probably largely unaffected, right? Like if you're a building owner or operator, your world is not going to change with respect to that, just based on how the grid is changing. But the second flavor, which we touched on a little bit, which is around performance BPSs, which is to say, you may have a threshold of energy use intensity or emissions intensity, and you need to get below that. That could be fairly substantially impacted. So maybe let's start with the energy use one. Energy use, I mean, the way the grid is changing right now, your buildings don't necessarily become more or less energy efficient just based on how the grid is changing, except for a small caveat, right? Maybe your tenants are actually, if the price of electricity is going up, you might have more price sensitivity to the cost of electricity. And so you might see very small adjustments at the margin, right? You might find that people are using slightly less electricity just because of how much more it costs. So from that perspective, you might actually get a net benefit if what you care about is being more energy efficient. But the emission side of things, and it's worth noting here that most BPSs at this stage are not emissions focused, but there are a few, and they're sort of at the cusp. And if I were a betting person, I would guess that more in the future will emerge. This is going to become a lot harder to comply with because they're setting for you sort of emissions thresholds. And if you are consuming, if most of your emissions are scope 2, that is to say, they come from the electricity you consume from the grid, and you don't have very much control over how green or how dirty the electricity you get from the grid is, you are largely at the mercy of what the grid is providing to you. And based on the current projections, our expectation is that the electricity from the grid is about to get a lot less green than we initially anticipated, say, a year ago. And so that means that your ability to comply with an emissions threshold could get much more challenging, and it places a lot more responsibility on building owners and operators to figure out creative ways of complying with that.
Yeah, Makes a lot of sense. And this is just so complex in that you have these different trends, these different goals, et cetera, that are in competition, and they don't necessarily all point to the same easiest, obvious answer. Similar to that, it leads to my next question, which is around data centers. You did touch on this, and I think everyone on this call knows the narrative here that data centers are proliferating. They're putting stress and strain on the grid. They're driving prices up, and they're causing folks to go search for sources of energy that might not be as clean as they would otherwise seek to have. And I think there's an interesting tension here in that a lot of these data center end customers are large tech firms that have some of the most aggressive sustainability goals within corporate America. So help me figure this out. What's going on here? How should we be thinking about? You've got this trend that's just dominating the story around grids right now, the build out of data centers. What does this mean for e-grid factors? When demand is going through the roof, everyone's looking for new supply, and at the same time, they have these sustainability goals. You know, how should we think about this? Because all the rest of us are still attached to that same grid. And what these guys do, it's going to have an impact on us. So help me square that.
Yeah, it definitely does. Just to maybe add slightly more color to what you said and help make it more concrete. I mean, a lot of, not necessarily the builders of the data centers, but certainly the users of the data centers are major tech players, you know, Meta, Google, Microsoft, et cetera. These are companies that were early movers in setting sustainability targets, and notably a lot of emissions reduction targets. And I don't think we've yet seen them rolling back those targets. So they still have fairly aggressive emissions reduction targets that they set before I think people really understood that AI was going to become as big a topic as it has become. And secondly, that the training of these AI models and their distribution would consume as much electricity as they had. So that's point number one, right? These large companies have massive electricity demands, but at the same time, very I'm not going to say not ironclad, but still quite ambitious emissions reduction targets that were set before knowing all this. Now, they may choose to roll some of those back as reality sets in. It's just hard to say at this stage whether or not that's the case. But at least right now, a lot of them are looking for more innovative on-site options to power some of these data centers. A lot of those are not yet ready for prime time, right? So you might have heard about small modular reactors, SMRs. As far as I know, those are not approved for usage yet. And so being able to have a small on-site nuclear reactor is not something that's going to overnight change the cleanliness of the energy that data centers consume. So what this likely means is that at least in the short to medium term, there's going to be a bit of a rush for cleaner energy to power these data centers so that these companies who have these aggressive, ambitious sustainability targets can still provide the services that they're trying to offer here through the demand that they need for the data centers, but at the same time, not completely scuttle their sustainability requirements. And if you play this all the way out to its logical conclusion, it may mean that not only is the price of electricity going up in these areas, it's also some of the quote unquote dirtiest energy that's left over for the remaining people who are consuming the electricity in the grid. Of course, the average is affected by the demand going up because mostly it's dirtier sources of energy that can come online quickly to meet that demand. But if in addition to that, you're also saying, well, you know, Microsoft requires, I made things up, 100 terawatt hours of solar energy, that you're moving down sort of the curve of generation availability from cleanest to dirtiest, and a lot of the tech players will be looking to get the cleanest, and that will leave mostly the dirtiest for everyone else. And so if you are, for an example, a real estate player who has a portfolio with properties in close proximity to some of these data centers, and you are looking at more than just the average E-grid factor, meaning like sort of you get very detailed in sort of what the marginal E-grid factor is. I think you might find that you're backsliding a little bit from where you might have been in the past in terms of what your emissions intensity is, because the grid is dirtier, the cleaner sources might be going to some of the tech players with whom you're competing, and what's left for you is generation from natural gas or coal or whatever it might be.
This is why I love talking to you, Andrew, because I feel like I gave you a simple question and you gave me this. It wasn't that simple, but you gave me every part of the narrative underpinning what's going on here. So all of this is in the report, guys. Please do check it out. I do want to take things back just a bit higher level before we then go to the audience Q&A. Just at a high level, Andrew, you're someone who's been around this space for a long time. You've done this, you've been running this tool for multiple years now. You've seen our forecasts be adjusted based on what's happened in the world. In this edition, in the 2025 edition, what stood out to you as the most surprising finding? Was there something in the report that maybe didn't, when you added up all these different narratives of what goes up, what goes down, the net result was something that wasn't necessarily what you expected? Yeah, what jumped out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just reflecting on where we were about a year ago. I don't think it was that easy to anticipate just how quickly data center demand was going to scale up and accelerate, right? It's not just that the velocity is high, it's also the acceleration is high. The rate of change is changing quickly as well. Now, you may be a skeptic and you may think that, AI it's way out over its skis and it's due for a correction of some sort. But if that's not the case, or even if it's only dialed back a little bit, we're still talking about some very eye-popping changes. I'm just returning again to that electricity demand graph, right? The demand from data centers has tripled in the last 10 years. 2014 to 2024 tripled. In the next 6 years, it's expected to triple again. And by that time, it's expected to exceed more than 10% of all electricity demand of the United States. And, I mentioned already that 600 terawatt hours that we're looking at, that's more than what the entire nation of France consumes in terms of electricity by a healthy margin. So that's one major surprise. The other major surprise to me, and this, again, totally unanticipated, you would have never thought to look at this a year ago, is the whole interplay with the Canadian electricity. I don't think I appreciated the extent to which some of the northern states of the United States have integrated sort of networks with grids with Canada, and how much also Canadian electricity, due to the investment in hydroelectric long ago, makes their grid considerably greener than a lot of the United States. And that's just kind of proof also that there's a lot of path dependency here, right? Like Canada's been investing in hydroelectric for decades, and that's been a primary source of their energy generation for decades. And now, whatever, 40 years down the road, they have just a considerably more green grid than we do. And so decisions made now, changing of incentives, just to bring this back sort of full circle, decisions made now about rolling back the IRA when it felt like there's a lot of good momentum towards more deployment of renewables could have lasting impacts that we could be feeling 20 or 30 years down the road. If we bring a lot of new peaker plants online, or we have new deployment of natural gas plants, this is something, those don't pay back overnight. It takes 10, 20 years to get the payback for those. And so you can expect that in most cases, if you are bringing a new piece of generation online, you as the investor are expecting that to be around for a while. So the grid of 20 years from now is deeply impacted by decisions made today. And it's not easy to pivot overnight.
Yeah. While you were speaking, I remembered a news piece I read maybe a year or two ago about how a wet season in Canada and a lot of snowfall led to lower E-grid factors across the northern US because all the hydro had more water behind it. They were spinning that out of the dams, et cetera. And so there's a level of volatility here where more snow means lower E-grid factors for building operators in Montana or whatnot. Yeah, and there's other challenges such as supply chains. I think I saw another report that a company building natural gas power plants only delivered one turbine in 2021 or two or something, and now they've got a backlog of orders for hundreds. So the world can turn. And that's why a report like this is useful to unpack what are all those trends, what are all those ways in which it can turn. I believe the report has, forgive me, I forget the exact terms, but high, medium, low scenarios of where the world could go. And so it unpacks what those could look like and what drivers could lead to faster, slower decarbonization. With that all said, that's enough from me. I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions as well. Sarah is manning our Q&A. So Sarah, I will toss it over to you.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of questions in the queue. So the first one I'll start with is a lot of what's driving the projected energy crunch is due to specific policies of the current administration. What if Congress flips in 2026?
That's a very good question. I would love to have a crystal ball to know the answer to that. I think a lot will depend on what, Congress looks like, and what are the different levers they're able to pull. I suspect that the IRA, at least in its former form, which was driving a lot of the renewable generation that was being deployed, is probably not going to be revived, at least even if Congress does flip in 2026. But there may be other things that are on the table, right? I think one of the major macro trends we did look at was the whole question around tariffs. That is probably one of the policy levers that would be most affected by either the ruling of the Supreme Court, and we'll have to continue to hold our breath there to see what that looks like. But let's imagine that there is a divided government in 2026. I have to imagine that some of the efforts by a Congress that's not the same party as the presidency, we might see greater opposition to the tariffs. And if there is greater opposition to the tariffs, that might relax some of the challenges that we've been seeing, or that we're currently projecting are going to persist on the grid. Just to again call back what those are, we might see a very different posture towards Canada. And so if you're in one of those northern states that relies on Canadian electricity, that may not be as much of a challenge anymore. But probably more impactfully, if the tariffs are pulled off of a lot of the components or technologies that are being used in renewable energy, think solar panels from China or metals from wherever else in the world, it could very quickly in very short order become more financially viable to deploy renewables again. Now, there was in the previous administration, it was financially more viable. Plus, there was the added benefit of a lot of incentives or subsidies. I don't think a lot of those incentives of subsidies are probably going to come back in the same way, but the economic math of doing some renewables still pencils out in a lot of cases, even if you don't have the subsidies behind it, especially if you are in a region where the cost of electricity is accelerating that quickly. So I would be hopeful that if Congress changes, maybe the tariffs would get rolled back and we could see the economics rebalance for more market-backed deployment of renewables again.
Great. Second question here that I have is, what's the risk that owners or developers will walk their clean standards back, even temporarily, local regulations notwithstanding? Are those regulations at risk as well as a matter of prudence?
This is a excellent question, and something I would probably defer to people that are actual owners and developers on. I can speak to the following so far. You know, we've already had a bit of a seismic shift, at least in terms of sentiment towards sustainability, just based on the Trump administration's posture towards it. I think we've seen that at a minimum, there's been a lot less open talk and showcasing, I think, of sustainability commitments and delivery by a lot of real estate players. I think oftentimes people refer to this as green hushing. Of course, there has to be a term for everything, but there's been a lot of green hushing over the last 10 months. But I think largely the organizations who were previously committed to a lot of sustainability are continuing to still be committed, albeit maybe not talking about it as openly. And so I think that provides a relatively good anecdote from which to look forward to the future, right? It may not be exactly the same, because I think what made the previous challenge difficult may not be the same in nature as what may make the future challenge difficult, meaning what we're looking at here is it just becoming a lot harder potentially to get things done in terms of achieving sustainability targets versus when it came to green hushing, it was just a question of sort of maybe not openly speaking about it as much. But I am hopeful that owners and developers will continue to try to stay the course. And in order to do that, I just think it means that you'll have to be a lot smarter about where you invest. Some of those retrofits on the margin may actually pencil out to be more attractive, right? So like take, for example, LED lighting, which is a favorite building retrofit that almost always pencils out. Well, relative to incandescent or more traditional forms of lighting, I'm sure now the business case is even more compelling. If the price of electricity goes up, every single kilowatt hour that you save just makes that business case more compelling. Where it gets complicated is obviously around the electrification of things, right? So if you're moving from a natural gas heater to an electric heat pump, it may become more challenging. And so it's hard to say where this will all shake out. I suspect that on the margin, some people will potentially pause or adjust their sustainability targets. But I am quite hopeful that the leaders will continue to lead and continue to try to deliver on their very ambitious targets, many of which are also much further out in the future, at least, right? So like, I think if you have, for example, a net zero ambition, I don't think I've seen any real estate players with a net zero ambition before 2035, probably closer to like 2040 and beyond. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't intermediate targets, but there's still a good deal of runway left on 2040. And if you are an optimist, you might believe that, okay, for now, we might face a few challenges for the next few years. It might get rocky, but hopefully down the road, either due to economic forces or, with the assistance of a different administration, maybe in 2 to 4 years, the political headwinds might flip to tailwinds again, and that will give you an opportunity to still stay the course with some of your longer term emissions reduction targets.
Great. And I think the final question, which I think that you have addressed some of this, but I'll ask it again, is, okay, so given all of this, what does this really mean for real estate owners, operators, and investors?
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about what it means. Maybe I'll instead say, what can you do? What is it can be a pretty bleak picture if you're sort of owning or operating buildings and you're saying price of electricity is going up, it's going to be harder to comply with these building performance standards, your sustainability targets might be in jeopardy. So maybe rather than saying, what does it mean, we can talk more about what can you do. And I think there's probably three things I would recommend doing. I think the first is really to understand what is your portfolio's exposure to what is likely to happen in the future, right? I think we've talked largely on balance about what this looks like on average for the US, but there's so many grids and smaller microgrids across the entire United States. I mean, last I remember, I think it's more than 1,000+ utility providers in the United States, each one with its own different combination of generation sources and transmission channels, et cetera, et cetera. All that to say is that it's really hard to paint with a broad brush what the future is going to look like for your specific portfolio. You really do need to understand at a much higher level of granularity where your exposure is, or where are you expected to see greater price pressure, where are you expected to see greater pressure on your sustainability targets. And then the second thing I would say is you really do need to be proactive. And that means, tactically speaking, if you are sort of a sustainability professional or practitioner within your organization, that probably means flagging this with your operations and finance teams to let them know, hey, this is probably coming. Looking at where we are right now, looking at the future, it could get a lot. We could be seeing a lot more pressure on our operating costs as a result of this. We might need to reevaluate our emissions reduction targets as a result of this. And we certainly need to plan for that, right? So that leads me to maybe what the third thing I would recommend is, which is don't just be proactive in communicating, be also pretty proactive in thinking through what you can do, especially around the pursuit of energy efficiency. And if I were in the shoes of a REIT or an investment manager, I would get really aggressive on energy efficiency as quickly as possible, because one of the easiest ways to insulate yourself from the impacts of the grid is to just be more energy efficient. So yes, that means doing more energy efficient retrofits. You do need to balance that a little bit with whether or not you're moving towards greater electrification of your assets. But then also it means really looking at where there are opportunities to do on-site renewables. If you have the opportunity, trying to work directly maybe with your utility provider to think through what PPAs could look like. That's not always the case, right? If you have a very geographically diffuse portfolio, that may not really be on the table because you're in so many different geographies. But where possible, that is a pretty effective strategy. And yeah, just keeping on top of the state of your properties. Where have you already gotten the low-hanging fruit in terms of energy efficiency retrofits? Where is it time for the next level of energy efficiency retrofits? And knowing what the business case is there, right? Like looking forward, projecting out, probably under multiple scenarios. Where does it make sense to do air source heat pumps? Where does it make sense to do upgrades to your building envelope that are going to improve the energy efficiency of your buildings? All of this, it's quite complicated, especially if you're a company with hundreds of buildings across the United States. So just really recognizing that it's a function of looking at this at a portfolio level, but understanding how all of these macro trends play out in different ways in different markets. I think that's really the secret here.
Excellent. Well, Andrew and Ben, I see no additional questions in the queue. So if all of you have some after this call, please feel free to reach out to Ben or Andrew at their email address, or also connect with them on LinkedIn. With that, again, thank you for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.